Hey there, my name is Marley and welcome back to my booktube channel. Today I'm going to be doing the mid-year book freakout tag. I think this is the 5th year now that I've done this tag. It is a very popular trend on booktube to do this tag halfway through the year. It's a little way to check in on your reading, talk about some of your favorites, some of your least favorites, also kind of talk about the books you want to read for the second half of the year. Maybe before we get into the tag questions, I could give a little update on my stats for the halfway point of the year. It's not exactly halfway because it is June 15th. So halfway would be like the end of June, but maybe we should check in on some of my yearly stats. So my total pages read right now is at 17,748. Hours listened for audiobooks is 31. Books acquired is 28, which is pretty high. I have been buying a lot of books this year, and books read is 51, which is pretty good because my goal is 100, as it always is. So I'm definitely on track for that goal. For books per month, January was definitely my best month with 14 books. Obviously, so far this month, I've only read 2, so it's my worst right now. Format, we have nearly 50% of the books I read have been physical, and then 45% have been ebook, and only 3 have been audiobooks, which is pretty typical for me. I don't listen to audiobooks very much. 56% of the books I've read have been adult, with only 43 being YA. 84% of the books I've read have been by female authors. The genre I've read the most of right now is fantasy, coming in at 35%, and then romance at 31%, which is interesting. Thriller is only at 19%. So that's weird for me. I'm actually reading a lot more romance than normal and a lot less thrillers. That's just with how it's been working out, and I definitely would like to change that for the rest of the year and pick up more thrillers. And I've been having a lot of 4 stars, so 43% of the books I rate 4 stars, and then I've rated quite a few 4.5 and 5 stars as well, so that's pretty good. Year published is kind of all over the map, but 14 of the books I've read have been from 2023 last year, and 9 have been from 2022, so I feel like I am mostly reading like newer books that were published in the last couple years. And in terms of how much I've spent on books so far this year, I spent around $316, and I've only read 46% of the books, so I'm not reading that many of the books that I'm buying. So let's get into the questions. Question number 1 is, of course, what's the best book you've read so far this year in 2024? I have a few 5-star books that I would consider my favorite, but probably my number 1 favorite book is actually the very first book that I read this year, and it's really stuck with me, and that is, of course, No Exit by Taylor Adams. This is a really fast-paced action kind of survivor thriller story about this girl who gets stranded at this rest stop during a blizzard, and then she finds that one of the people she's stuck at this rest stop is a criminal who has kidnapped a child, and she is trying to, number 1, save the child, number 2, also survive and like save herself and get out of this situation. This book was just perfect. It wasn't necessarily the most twisty thriller like I normally like, but it was, as I already said, so fast-paced, so exciting and dramatic and emotional. It has to be one of my favorite books that I've read so far this year. Another book I really adored this year was the reappearance of Rachel Price by Holly Jackson. Of course, her books are always on my favorites list. This is a young adult thriller about a girl whose mom disappeared when she was young, and it's always been this unsolved mystery case of where her mother is and if she's still alive, if she was murdered. And then now our main character, I think, is like 18, and her mother suddenly reappears. So hence the title, The Reappearance of Rachel Price. We're trying to figure out where her mother has been all these years and why did she suddenly reappear now. Our main character's family has been keeping a lot of secrets. Her mom might be keeping secrets. She doesn't know if she can trust her. And as always, Holly Jackson is just so talented at writing these young adult murder mystery stories. I just highly recommend this. Thirdly, I know I should only mention 1 book per question, but I just can't. A recent read of mine was The 7-Year Slip by Ashley Poston. This is another book that I think is really going to stick with me for the rest of the year. This is one of the best romances that I have read. You guys know I always say on my channel that I rarely rate romances 5 stars, but this had to get one from me. I just think it has every single element that you could want in a romance, and it was just so well done. So I'm also going to mention that one. Question 2 is, what's the best sequel you've read so far in 2024? And I feel like I have a couple things I could say for this one too. Heartstopper Volume 5 was just such a great continuation of the Heartstopper series. I feel like I don't even need to speak on this one too much because they're so popular on BookTube, but I really like how this series explores so many different topics that teens are dealing with, especially teens who are queer. I just adore Nick and Charlie's characters and their relationship so much that I just always enjoy every single volume. Another one I loved and was actually a little surprised by was The Brothers Hawthorne by Jennifer Lynn Barnes. This was a little continuation of the Inheritance Games trilogy. At first, I felt like this was going to be maybe a little bit of a cash grab, like Jennifer just continuing the series because they're so popular, but I actually really enjoyed this one. Instead of it following from Avery's point of view, like the original trilogy, we are following the point of view of two of the Hawthorne brothers, Grayson and Jameson, who I adore both those characters, and both of them have their own little mysteries that they are trying to solve and their own plot lines that end up kind of coming together at the end. If you like the original trilogy, I actually do really recommend that you read this, especially if you are really invested in the characters and the relationships. It just really is a fun time. I guess we'll talk more about this kind of series later. And another one I read pretty recently is Just for the Summer by Abby Jimenez. This is the third book in the Part of Your World companion romance series. The first half I was a little bit questioning it, but by the end it was just such a good wrap up to this series that I really have to recommend to everyone if you've read the first two books. We're following our two main characters who meet because they both seem to have the same curse, where everyone that they break up with finds their person right after. So they decide to date each other so that when they break up, they will both finally find their person. And that sounds very like surface level. The story gets so much deeper than that. Both of them are dealing with such heavy issues, such emotional kind of issues, yet they grow this really great relationship together despite all of that. It just was beautiful to read, and there's so many little connections and cameos from the other characters from Part of Your World and yours truly that you gotta check it out. Question 3 is a new release you haven't read yet but you want to. One of those for me is The Prisoner's Throne by Holly Black. This is the sequel to The Stolen Heir. I also think this cover is so pretty, but I love all of the covers in this series. This is the spin-off duology following the Folk of the Air trilogy, so The Cruel Prince and all those books. I feel like I didn't like the first one as much as the Cruel Prince trilogy, but I'm still really enjoying it. I love Holly Black. I love when she writes about fairies. I just love fairy mythology and fairy lore, so I really enjoy this series and I look forward to reading this one. Another one I don't have is Old Flames, New Fortunes by Sarah Hogle. Sarah Hogle is one of my favorite romance authors, so obviously I'm excited to read her newest release. I've been hearing good things about this one so far. It seems to have a little bit of magical realism again, and it's about a girl who runs like a flower shop or something like that. And then there is a second chance romance where I was just reading this description. I think it was where she ends up fake dating her ex's like brother or stepbrother, and so then suddenly she comes back into the same like circle as her ex, and it's some sort of like second chance romance thing, which I feel like she's really good at second chance romance based on You Deserve Each Other, which is my favorite book by her, so very highly anticipating this one. And another one is Attached at the Hip by Christine Riccio. I don't have my hands on this one yet either, but it is the third book from her. I have been a big fan of her YouTube channel since I was younger, Full Bananas Books, and she has become an author in the last few years. I've read her first two books and they were not my favorite necessarily, but I still enjoy reading her books and supporting her. This one sounds like her best one yet. It is a little bit based on Survivor because I know Christine really loves Survivor. I enjoy the show as well. And it's about this girl who applies to be on the show, but then finds out she's going to be on this special like romance edition of Survivor where she is like handcuffed or tied or attached to the hip, whatever, to her ex. So we have another second chance romance situation here, and I think they're in some sort of competition and obviously having to bond again years later. So I just think it sounds like a really fun premise. It would be a good summer read, I think, so I need to get my hands on this one quick. Next up is most anticipated release for the second half of the year, so books that are not out yet. First of all, I want to mention Slow Dance by Rainbow Rowell. I feel like it's been so long since she has come out with a book and so long since I've read one of her books, but she was probably one of my favorite authors when I was younger because she wrote Fangirl and she wrote Carry On, which were two of my favorite books of all time. So I'm definitely excited to see her putting out books again. This book does sound a little bit basic, where it's a romance book about these two people who are really, really good friends when they were younger and didn't quite realize that they were also in love with each other. And now it's been years later, they haven't spoken in years, but I think they end up at this wedding together and are sort of reconnecting and realizing how much they've missed each other and that they did actually love each other back in the day. So kind of a basic premise. I even read something similar to that recently, Every Summer After by Carly Fortune, but I did really, really love that book, and I feel like it is a fun premise, a nice little friends to lovers story, so I'm gonna be looking out for that one. Then I said we'd come back to Jennifer Lynn Barnes' The Grandest Game. This is kind of a continuation of this Inheritance Game story, but technically I think this is considered a new series because at the end of The Brothers Hawthorne, we did find out that Avery and the Hawthorne brothers are going to be starting this competition where the prize is like giving away some of the Hawthorne money. So they're gonna welcome, I think, 7 contestants to this big game. I assume of like riddles and stuff like that, you know, these characters are really into, but I assume it's gonna take a bit of a dark turn as well. I just think it sounds so good. So I would recommend looking into this book or staying tuned on my channel for when I read it. Next up, of course, is a new release coming from Casey McQuiston called The Pairing. I have really adored all of their books, so of course I'm excited for The Pairing. This one is another second chance romance. I guess that's a very popular trope right now. We're branching away from fake dating, and I guess we're entering the second chance romance arc here. But this is about 2 exes who I think had planned this big Europe trip together when they were obviously still dating, and now they've been broken up for years, and they both randomly decide to go on this trip that I guess they already had booked, and they go at the same time. I guess it's a little bit enemies to lovers because I think they are like at odds with each other and decide to make a bet of like who can sleep with the most people. But then obviously they end up probably falling back together. So I just think that one sounds really fun. Wow, it seems like I really am in my romance era with all of these new releases that I'm anticipating being romance. Okay, question 5 is your biggest disappointment. One of my biggest disappointments was definitely The Fury by Alex Michaelides. I think I ended up rating this 4 stars technically when I read it, but looking back, I definitely should have rated it lower, like 3.5 or even 3. I think it was just so confusing for me because I read it in one night. And obviously that kind of shows that the writing was engaging enough to keep me reading like the whole night. But I was not really pleased with like the actual book and with what actually happened and with the characters and with the plot. It starts out with kind of a typical murder mystery start where we have this friend group going to some island in Greece or something, and then one of the characters ends up dead, and it's a bit of like a whodunit situation, but it goes on a way different tangent, and I just didn't like where it went. And so obviously this was disappointing because I have loved his previous 2 books. I gave them both 5 stars. So I don't know what this means for moving forward with me and this author. I guess I will still give whatever book he puts out next a chance, but I definitely was let down by this one. Another one I was disappointed by was You Again by Kate Goldbeck. I actually picked this book or suggested it for my book club with my friends because I had heard some really great things about this romance, and I ended up being quite disappointed in it and really not liking the couple in this book. It's kind of like a Harry Met Sally retelling. It's like this rom-com that takes place in New York. It sounds like it's really going to be great. It's based off like Raylo fanfic, which in the past I have liked some Raylo fanfic with Ali Hazelwood, for example, but it just really didn't work for me in terms of the characters and mainly the character dynamic. I felt like the guy was just kind of forcing the girl to be with him and being kind of like a baby about it, and I just didn't root for them. So that's kind of the point of a romance. So if you're not rooting for the characters, kind of a flop. And another one I was disappointed with really quickly was The First Lie Wins by Ashley Elston. I'm pretty sure this is a Reese Witherspoon pick, and that's why I was kind of seeing the cover around and kind of getting interested in it. But actually reading it and the premise of it, it was just not the type of book that I'm gonna enjoy. It is a thriller, but it was very much like about a woman who was like a con artist and she was doing this certain job, and it's just like not a setup that I would want. And this is one of the audiobooks I read, so I did read it fairly quickly, but I found myself just being like, why am I listening to this? What is going on? Why do we have to know all these flashbacks? Like, I just wasn't interested in the actual plot. Next up is biggest surprise. One of the biggest surprises for me was The Bodyguard by Catherine Center. As I said before, I'm just kind of getting into my first year of like loving romance, and this is one of the books that I think I read early in the year and gave 5 stars. And I was just shocked that I could enjoy a romance book so much, especially a rom-com like this. It's about a woman who is a bodyguard for this famous guy. She has to fake date him because he doesn't want people in his life to know that he has a bodyguard, and because she's a girl and she's like a very kind of small cutesy girl, it's easy to pass her off on just his girlfriend rather than a bodyguard. It just was so funny. It was so cute, but it also had this like emotional depth as well, as both the characters are dealing with some loss, some grief. This is just my #1 romance recommendation, I think. Really quickly, another romance that really surprised me was Fool Me Once by Ashley Winstead, just because, again, this was towards the beginning of the year where I wasn't as accustomed to enjoying romance on this level. So I really enjoyed the plot in this one. Again, the characters and their chemistry and their dynamic. It just made me realize like, wow, I actually do love romance books. Favorite new author, debut, or new to you? So 2 authors that I'm loving this year that I never read from before. Obviously Taylor Adams. I already mentioned loving No Exit, but I also read his book The Last Word, and I also gave that thriller 5 stars. Maybe it wasn't as good as No Exit, but I still absolutely loved it for the same reasons that I loved No Exit. Another author that is not a new author, but she's new to me, was Laini Taylor with Daughter of Smoke and Bone. Obviously, this is very much a throwback book, but I never read from her before. This is a young adult fantasy from her that I actually really enjoyed. It really kind of stuck out to me amongst all these kind of throwback YA fantasy books. So I'm looking forward to reading more from Laini Taylor for sure, especially in this series. The next question is newest fictional crush. A character I quite liked was from Silver in the Bone by Alexandra Bracken. I think his name was Emrys, was the kind of love interest for our main character. So I would say he's kind of like a little fictional crush, just because this is one of the ships that I really enjoyed this year. I really liked his relationship with our main character, and he was definitely like the bad boy stereotype. Every Summer After by Carly Fortune, which I mentioned before, I really liked the love interest Sam in this book. I feel like he was such a real kind of unique love interest, and maybe that's just because we saw him throughout many ages. We first meet him when he's a child and we see him grow into this man, and so I really liked seeing so much of his life and how he was as a kid and how he just grew up to be such a great man as well. Another one has to be Miles from Funny Story, of course. I always love Emily Henry's heroes. I always find them so relatable, and again, just actually I'm not even gonna say real because I feel like these men are not real. Like, they are like a dream. Miles is a bartender, and he's just like a really nice guy. He stood out a little bit to me compared to Emily Henry's other male characters. I feel like he's a little bit different, but still just such a great character. Okay, speaking of characters, then we have just new favorite character in general. I'm gonna go back to No Exit really quickly and just say Darby, the main character in this book. I don't know if it's because we went through such a crisis and such a trauma with her, but I really did feel bonded with her by the end, like with the emotional stuff. Like, I was crying because of things to do with her. Like, I just really respected that girl. Also, Rachel Price. So Rachel Price is the mother in this book, who our main character Belle is quite like suspicious of, but I adored her character. I loved Rachel. I was rooting for her the whole time. The mother-daughter kind of relationship and aspects of this book were some of my favorites. So I just really adored Rachel and how strong she was. I also really liked the character Misery from Bride by Ali Hazelwood. Ali is always just so funny to me and makes her characters so like quirky and not even relatable, but just very quirky and fun. So I love her for that. I loved Misery in this book. Really quickly, I know I'm doing so many answers per question, but Emily Wilde from Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. She is just such a cute little character. I love how passionate she is about her work, her studies, her research when it comes to fairies. She's also very quirky and like not always understanding people and social dynamics. She can be very endearing, and she ends up, you know, saving the town in this book and just being a real hero. And so I love her for that. A book that made me cry would have to be The 7 Year Slip. I read it recently. It just really was beautiful. beautiful. It's about this girl who works in publishing, and her aunt has recently passed away, and that is part of the aspect that really made me teary-eyed. So much of this book is obviously focused on the romance, which I adored, but so much of it is also about this girl's love for her aunt, and we learn so much about her aunt's life. I guess the regrets kind of that the aunt had, and the hardships that she went through, and our main character's great memories of traveling the world with her. And that was definitely one of the things that really tugged at my heartstrings and brought a lot of emotion. On the other hand, a book that made you happy, I'm gonna say the Full Metal Alchemist manga series. I'm finding them very, very fun. It has to deal with, you know, some like action and magic and like alchemy and fighting and saving the day and stuff, but it's actually very, very humorous as well. So that series has definitely been making me happy. And I mean, it's in the title, but I'll just also shout out Emily Henry's Funny Story too. Her books always make me so happy with the romance, with the humor, the banter that the characters have, the friendship and family aspects that she includes. Like, it's just a good time. Most beautiful book you bought so far this year. I know I've bought a lot of books this year, but the one that kind of stands out to me is Emily Wilde. Maybe it doesn't look like that stunning, but I just kind of love how it's like printed on the actual like hard cover. I think that's very cool and unique, and I just really love that about this book. Okay, I'm trying to rush through because I feel like I've talked so much. Last question is, what book do you have to read by the end of the year? I'm gonna mention some that I haven't mentioned yet. Some books I really want to read by the end of the year is the rest of Alice Oseman's backlist. I believe the only ones I have left are Solitaire, which I think is her very first book that is about Tori Spring, which is Charlie's sister, and I still have not read it, and I really want to, just to kind of get background on Tori as a character. And then we have this Winter, which is then a little novella that I think also follows Tori as well as Charlie and Oliver. Okay, so yeah, once I read Solitaire, I can read this one, and then I'll have read all her books. Another one is Hellbent by Leigh Bardugo. I would love to fit this into one of my TBRs simply because I loved the first book, Ninth House. It was one of my favorite books that I read last year. It's of course a adult fantasy series with dark academia vibes, and I've heard really good things about the second one as well. Then a couple of series that I started this year I would like to continue, especially because they're just such old books and I own all of them. I already mentioned her, Laini Taylor with Daughter of Smoke and Bone series. There's 2 more books in the series, so I would love to continue with these, especially because I did really like the first one. And then we also have the Red Queen series. I think this is the second one. Glass Sword, I'm pretty sure I have this whole series too. So I would love to continue with both of these series because I did start them. So I need to start continuing series rather than just starting them. This was another like young adult fantasy / dystopian series. So they were both pretty enjoyable, and I'm down to continue them both. So that is going to be the end of my mid-year book freakout tag, whatever it's called. Definitely let me know your thoughts below in the comments, your answer to any of these questions, or if you have any comments on my answers. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the second half of the year. I'll see you next time. Bye.